Welcome back to House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I'm Catherine. I'll be reading chapter 10 today. In chapter 9, Lily has gone back to Mrs. Peniston's place. That's her aunt. She's going to stay there now. It's October, and her aunt is back from her own travels. She likes to go abroad. It's strange that she's there. She's not feeling very happy about things. She's normally not able to be home at her aunt's because she's invited to so many parties, but now she's realized that her invitations are fewer, and she realizes that her popularity is waning. She also notices that she's not interesting to them anymore as Miss Bart. If she were to change her status and be Mrs. somebody like Mrs. Percy Grice, but that opportunity has sailed, then she would have been renewed as a feature of interest, so invited to more things. So she's invited out less. As she's thinking about this and going up the stairs, and the house smells bad to her because it's being washed and all the soaps and different products are kind of insulting her sense of smell, she gets a call, or she walks into the parlor or the drawing room, and she gets a message. She hears the doorbell ring. That surprises her. And so the maid goes to reply, and then she comes back with a message that there's a woman there to see her, a Mrs. Heffen. She goes, I don't know anybody by that name. Well, okay, allow her in. So she goes to the door to see who this lady is, and the lady says, I have a packet of letters that may concern you. She instinctively thinks, this is not for the servant to hear. So she says, come with me, and brings her into the drawing room. She said, I used to sweep in Mr. Lawrence Selden's apartment, and he receives a lot of letters, but he fastidiously destroys his letters every single time. But he was getting so many that he started to be a little bit less entire about his destruction methods, and he started just tearing them in two or ripping them up and throwing them in the waste. Well, she got a hold of those letters and taped them all back together, and they are love letters to him, and evidently by Mrs. Dorset, Bertha Dorset. Well, that's breaking the rules. She can flirt with him all she wants in the company of others and in front of her husband, because then he's tacitly okaying it. But letters sent by a married lady to a single man, that's a big no-no. And apparently she has sent plenty of them. So this Mrs. Happen has them all in her charge. And she thinks that the letters came from Lily. Lily gets to the point and says, how much? And the woman, emboldened, gives an impressive amount. We're not told how much. And Lily says, no. She says, I'll give you half of that. Well, it's a long process, but she ends up getting her way. She ends up paying half the amount that the woman first proposed. And then she walks upstairs. Well, then her aunt comes home and a few other things. But eventually she walks upstairs with a bundle of letters. She's about to throw them into the fire because that would be the right thing to do. But her aunt has just told her stories about how Bertha Dorset has been going around saying horrible things about Lily and gossiping in a mean way. So Lily's not going to destroy them. She just likes the idea that she has them, and they could ruin Bertha. That's where the story leaves off. Chapter 10. The autumn dragged on monotonously. Miss Bart had received 1 or 2 notes from Gerty Trenor reproaching her for not returning to Bellamont, but she replied evasively, alleging the obligation to remain with her aunt. In truth, however, she was fast wearying of her solitary existence with Mrs. Peniston, and only the excitement of spending her newly acquired money lightened the dullness of the days. All her life, Lily had seen money go out as quickly as it came in, and whatever theories she cultivated as to the prudence of setting aside a part of her gains, she had unhappily no saving vision of the risks of the opposite course. It was a keen satisfaction to feel that for a few months, at least, she would be independent of her friend's bounty, that she could show herself abroad without wondering whether some penetrating eye would detect in her dress the traces of Gerty Trenor's refurbished splendor. The fact that the money freed her temporarily from all minor obligations obscured her sense of the greater one it represented, of having never known before What it was to command so large a sum, she lingered delectably over the amusement of spending it. It was on one of those occasions that, leaving the shop, where she had spent an hour of deliberation over a dressing case of the most complicated elegance, she ran across Miss Farish, who had entered the same establishment with the modest object of having her watch repaired. Lily was feeling unusually virtuous. She had decided to defer the purchase of the dressing case till she should receive the bill for her new opera cloak, and the resolve made her feel much richer than when she had entered the shop. In this mood of self-approval, she had a sympathetic eye for others, and she was struck by her friend's air of dejection. Miss Farish, it appeared, had just left the committee meeting of a struggling charity in which she was interested. The object of the association was to provide comfortable lodgings with a reading room and other modest distractions where young women of the class employed in downtown offices might find a home when out of work or in need of rest, and the first year's financial report showed so deplorably small a balance that Miss Farish, who was convinced of the urgency of the work, felt proportionately discouraged by the small amount of interest it aroused. The other, regarding sentiments, had not been cultivated in Lily, and she was often bored by the relation of her friend's philanthropic efforts. But today, her quick dramatizing fancy seized on the contrast between their own situation and that represented by some of Gerty's cases. These were young girls like herself, perhaps some pretty, some not without a trace of her finer sensibilities. She pictured herself leading such a life as theirs, a life in which achievement seemed as squalid as failure, and the vision made her shudder sympathetically. The price of the dressing case was still in her pocket, and drawing out her little gold purse, she slipped a liberal fraction of the amount into Miss Farish's hand. The satisfaction derived from this act was all that the most ardent moralist could have desired. Lily felt a new interest in herself as a person of charitable instincts. She had never before thought of doing good with the wealth that she so often dreamed of possessing, but now her horizon was enlarged by the vision of a prodigal philanthropy. Moreover, by some obscure process of logic, she felt that her momentary burst of generosity had justified all previous extravagances and excused any which she must subsequently indulge. Miss Ferris's surprise and gratitude confirmed this feeling, and Lily parted from her with a sense of self-esteem, which she naturally mistook for the fruits of altruism. About this time she was farther cheered by the invitation to spend a Thanksgiving week at a camp in the Adirondacks. The invitation was one which a year earlier would have provoked a less ready response, for the party, though organized by Mrs. Fisher, was ostensibly given by a lady of obscure origin and indomitable social ambitions whose acquaintance Lily had hitherto avoided. Now, however, she was disposed to coincide with Mrs. Fisher's view that it didn't matter who gave the party as long as things were well done, and doing things well under competent direction was Mrs. Wellington Bry's strong point. The lady, whose consort was known as Welly Bry on the Stock Exchange, was in sporting circles, and had already sacrificed one husband and sundry minor considerations to her determination to get on, and having obtained a hold on Carrie Fisher, she was astute enough to perceive the wisdom of committing herself entirely to that lady's guidance. Everything accordingly was well done, for there was no limit to Mrs. Fisher's prodigality when she was not spending her own money. And if, as she remarked to a pupil, a good cook was the best introduction to society. If the company was not as select as the cuisine, the Welly Brys, at least, had the satisfaction of figuring for the first time in the society columns in company with one or two noticeable names. And foremost among these was, of course, Miss Bartz. The young lady was treated by her host with corresponding deference, and she was in the mood when such attentions are acceptable, whatever their source. Miss Bry's admiration was a mirror in which Lily's self-complacency recovered its lost outline. No insect hangs its nest on the threads as frail as those which will sustain the weight of human vanity. And the sense of being of importance among the insignificant was enough to restore to Miss Bart the gratifying consciousness of power. If these people paid court to her, it proved that she was still conspicuous in the world to which they aspired, and she was not above a certain enjoyment in dazzling them by her fineness, in developing their puzzled perception of her superiorities. Perhaps, however, her enjoyment proceeded more than she was aware from the physical stimulus of the excursion, the challenge of crisp, cold, and hard exercise, the responsive thrill of her body to the influences of the winter woods. She returned to town in a glow of rejuvenation, conscious of a clearer color in her cheeks, a fresh elasticity in her muscles. The future seemed full of a vague promise, and all her apprehensions were swept out of sight on the buoyant current of her mood. A few days after her return to town, she had the unpleasant surprise of a visit from Mr. Rosedale. He came late, at the confidential hour when the tea-table still lingers by the fire in friendly expectancy, and his manner showed a readiness to adapt itself to the intimacy of the occasion. Lily, who had a vague sense of his being somehow connected with her lucky speculations, tried to give him the welcome he expected, but there was something in the quality of his geniality which chilled her own, and she was conscious of marking each step in their acquaintance by a fresh blunder. Mr. Rosedale, making himself promptly at home in an adjoining easy-chair and sipping his tea critically with the comment, "You ought to go to my man for something really good," appeared totally unconscious of the repugnance which kept her in frozen erectness behind the urn. It was perhaps her very manner of holding herself aloof that appealed to his collector's possession for the rare and unattainable. He gave, at any rate, no sign of resenting it, and seemed prepared to supply in his own manner all the ease that was lacking in hers. His object in calling was to ask her to go to the opera in his box on the opening night, and seeing her hesitate, he said persuasively, "Mrs. Fisher is coming, and I've secured a tremendous admirer of yours who would never forgive me if you don't accept." As Lily's silence left him with this allusion on his hands, he added with a confidential smile, "Gus Trenor has promised to come to town on purpose. I fancy he'd go a good deal further for the pleasure of seeing you." Miss Bart felt an inward motion of annoyance. It was distasteful enough to hear her name coupled with Trenor's, and on Rosedale's lips the allusion was particularly unpleasant. "The Trenors are my best friends. I think we should all go a long way to see each other," she said, absorbing herself in the preparation of fresh tea. Her visitor's smile grew increasingly intimate. "Well, I wasn't thinking of Mrs. Trenor at the moment. They say Gus doesn't always, Then, dimly conscious that he had not struck the right note, he added, with a well-meant effort at diversion, "How's your luck been going in Wall Street, by the way? I hear Gus pulled off a nice little pile for you last month." Lily put down the tea-caddy with an abrupt gesture. She felt that her hands were trembling and clasping them on her knee to steady them, but her lip trembled too, and for a moment she was afraid the tremor might communicate itself to her voice. When she spoke, however, it was in a tone of perfect lightness. "Yes, I had a little bit of money to invest, and Mr. Trenor, who helps me about such matters, advised my putting it in stocks instead of a mortgage, as my aunt's agent wanted me to do, and as it happened, I made a lucky turn. Is that what you call it? For you make a great many yourself, I believe." She was smiling back at him now, relaxing the tension of her attitude and admitting him, by imperceptible gradations of glance and manner, a step farther toward intimacy. The protective instinct always nerved her to successful dissimulation, and it was not the first time she had used her beauty to divert attention from the inconvenient topic. When Mr. Rosedale took leave, he carried with him not only her acceptance of his invitation, but a general sense of having comported himself in a way calculated to advance his cause. He had always believed he had a light touch and a knowing way with women, and the prompt manner in which Miss Bart, as he would have phrased it, had come into line, confirmed his confidence in his powers of handling the skittish sex. Her way of glossing over the transaction with Trenor he regarded at once as a tribute to his own acuteness and of confirmation of his suspicions. The girl was evidently nervous, and Mr. Rosedale, if he saw no other means of advancing his acquiescence with her, was not about taking advantage of her nervousness. He left Lily to a passion of disgust and fear. It seemed incredible that Gus Trenor should have spoken of her to Rosedale. With all his faults, Trenor had the safeguard of his traditions, and was the less likely to overstep them because he was so purely instinctive. But Lily recalled with a pang that there were convivial moments when, as Judy had confided to her, Gus talked foolishly. In one of those, no doubt, the fatal word had slipped from him. As for Rosedale, she did not, after the first shock, greatly care what conclusions he had drawn. Though usually adroit enough where her own interests were concerned, she made the mistake, not uncommon to persons in whom the social habits are instinctive, of supposing that the inability to acquire them quickly implies a general dullness. Because a blue bottle bangs irrationally against a window pane, the drawing-room naturalist may forget that under less artificial conditions it is capable of measuring distances and drawing conclusions with all the accuracy needful to its welfare. And the fact that Mr. Rosedale's drawing-room manner lacked perspective made Lily class him with Trenor and the other dull men she knew, and assume that a little flattery and the occasional acceptance of his hospitality would suffice to render him innocuous. However, there could be no doubt of the expediency of showing herself in his box on the opening night of the opera, and after all, since Judy Trenor had promised to take him up that winter, it was as well to reap this advantage of being first in the field. For a day or two after Rosedale's visit, Lily's thoughts were dogged by the consciousness of Trenor's shadowy claim, and she wished she had a clearer notion of the exact nature of the transaction which seemed to have put her in his power, but her mind shrank from any unusual application, and she was always helplessly puzzled by figures. Moreover, she had not seen Trenor since the day of the Van Osburgh wedding, and in his continued absence the trace of Rosedale's words were soon effaced by other impressions. When the opening night of the opera came, her apprehensions had so completely vanished that the sight of Trenor's ruddy countenance in the back of Mr. Rosedale's box filled her with a sense of pleasant reassurance. Lily had not quite reconciled herself to the necessity of appearing as Rosedale's guest on so conspicuous an occasion, but it was a relief to find herself supported by any one of her own set, for Miss Fisher's social habits were too promiscuous for her presence to justify Miss Bart's. To Lily, always inspirited by the prospect of showing her beauty in public, the conscious tonight of all the added enhancements of dress, the insistency of Trenor's gaze, merged itself into the general stream of admiring looks of which she felt herself the center. Ah, it was good to be young, to be radiant, to glow with a sense of slenderness, strength, and elasticity, of well-poised lines and happy tints, to feel oneself lifted to a height apart by that incommunicable grace which is the bodily counterpart of genius. All means seemed justifiable to attain such an end, or rather by a happy shifting of lights with which practice had familiarized Miss Bart, the cause shrank to a pinpoint in the general brightness of the effect. But brilliant young ladies, a little blinded by their own effulgence, are not apt to forget that the modest satellite, drowned in their light, is still performing its own revolutions and generating heat at its own rate. If Lily's poetic enjoyment of the moment was undisturbed by the base thought that her gown and opera cloak had been indirectly paid for by Gus Trenor, the latter had not sufficient poetry in his composition to lose sight of these prosaic facts. He knew only that he had never seen Lily look smarter in her life, and there wasn't a woman in the house who showed off good clothes as she did, and that hitherto he, to whom she owed the opportunity of making this display, had reaped no return beyond that of gazing at her in company with several hundred other pairs of eyes. It came to Lily, therefore, as a disagreeable surprise, when in the back of the box, where they found themselves alone between two acts, Trenor said without preamble and in a tone of sulky authority, "Look here, Lily, how is a fellow ever to see anything of you? I'm in town 3 or 4 days in the week, and you know a line to the club will always find me. But you don't seem to remember my existence nowadays, unless you want to get a tip out of me." The fact that the remark was in distinctly bad taste did not make it any easier to answer, for Lily was vividly aware that it was not the moment for the drawing up of her slim figure and surprised lifting of her brows by which she usually quelled incipient signs of familiarity. "I'm very much flattered by your wanting to see me," she returned, essaying lightness instead. "But unless you have mislaid my address, it would have been easy to find me any afternoon at my aunt's. In fact, I rather expected you to look me up there." If she hoped to mollify him by this last concession, the attempt was a failure, for he only replied with a familiar lowering of the brows that made him look his dullest when he was angry. "Hang going to your aunt's and wasting the afternoon listening to a lot of other chaps talking to you. You know I'm not the kind to sit in a crowd and jaw. I'd always made rather clear that when that sort of circus is going on. But why can't we go off somewhere on a little lark together, a nice quiet little expedition like that drive at Bellamont the day that you met me at the station?" He leaned unpleasantly close in order to convey this suggestion, and she fancied she caught a significant aroma which explained the dark flush on his face and the glistening dampness on his forehead. The idea that any rash answer might provoke an unpleasant outburst tempered her disgust with caution, and she answered with a laugh, I don't see how one can very well take country drives in town, but I am not always surrounded by an admiring throng, and if you will let me know what afternoon you are coming, I will arrange things so that we can have a nice quiet talk." "Hang talking! That's what you always say," returned Trenor, whose expletives lacked variety. "You put me off with that at the Van Osberg wedding, but the plain English of it is that now you've got what you wanted out of me, you'd rather have any other fellow about." His voice had risen sharply with those last words, and Lily flushed with annoyance, but she kept command of the situation and laid a persuasive hand on his arm. "Don't be foolish, Gus. I can't let you talk to me in that ridiculous way. If you really want to see me, why shouldn't we take a walk in the park some afternoon? I agree with you that it's amusing to be rustic in town, and if you like, I'll meet you there, and we'll go and feed the squirrels, and you shall take me out on the lake in the steam gondola." She smiled as she spoke, letting her eyes rest on his in a way that took the edge from her banter and made him suddenly malleable to her will. "All right, then. That's a go. Will you come tomorrow? Tomorrow at 3 o'clock at the end of the mall. I'll be there sharp. Remember, you won't go back on me, Lily." But to Miss Bart's relief, the repetition of her promise was cut short by the opening of the box door to admit George Dorset. Trenor sulkily yielded his place, and Lily turned a brilliant smile on the newcomer. She had not talked with Dorset since their visit at Bellamont, but something in his look and manner told her that he recalled the friendly footing on which they had last met. He was not a man to whom the expression of admiration came easily. His long, sallow face and distrustful eyes seemed always barricaded against the expansive emotions. But where her own influence was concerned, Lily's intuitions sent out thread-like feelers, and as she made room for him on the narrow sofa, she was sure he found a dumb pleasure in being near her. Few women took the trouble to make themselves agreeable to Dorset, and Lily had been kind to him at Bellamont, and was now smiling on him with a divine renewal of kindness. "Well, here we are, in for another 6 months of caterwauling," he began complainingly. "Not a shade of difference between this year and the last, except that the women have got new clothes and the singers haven't got new voices. My wife's musical, you know. Puts me through a course of this every winter. It isn't so bad on Italian nights, but then she comes late, and then there's time to digest. But when they give Wagner, we have to rush dinner, and I pay up for it, and the draughts are damnable, asphyxia in the front and pleurisy in the back, There's Trevor leaving the box without drawing the curtain. With a hide like that, drafts don't make any difference. Did you ever watch Trenor eat? If you did, you'd wonder why he's alive. I suppose he's leather inside too. But I came to say that my wife wants you to come down to our place next Sunday. Do, for heaven's sake, say yes. She's got a lot of bores coming, intellectual ones. I mean, that's her new line, you know? And I'm not sure it ain't worse than the music. Some of 'em got long hair and they started an argument with the soup and don't notice when things are handed to them. The consequence is that dinner gets cold and I have dyspepsia. The silly ass! Silverton brings them to the house. He writes poetry, you know. And Bertha and he are getting tremendously thick. She could write better than any of 'em if she chose, and I don't blame her for wanting clever fellows about. All I say is, don't let me see 'em eat. The gist of this strange communication gave Lily a distinct thrill of pleasure. Under ordinary circumstances, there would have been nothing surprising in an invitation from Bertha Dorset, but since the Bellament episode, an unavowed hostility had kept the two women apart. Now, with a start of inner wonder, Lily felt that her thirst for retaliation had died out. If you would forgive your enemy, says the Malay proverb, first inflict a hurt on him. And Lily was experiencing the truth of the apothegm. If she had destroyed Mrs. Dorset's letters, she might have continued to hate her, but the fact that they remained in her possession had fed her resentment to satiety. She uttered a smiling acceptance, hailing in the renewal of the tie and escape from Trenor's importunities. Chapter 11. Meanwhile, the holidays had gone by and the season was beginning. Fifth Avenue had become a nightly torrent of carriages, surging upward to the fashionable quarters about the park, where illuminated windows and outspread awnings betokened the usual routine of hospitality. Other tributary currents crossed the main stream, bearing their freight to the theatres, restaurants, or opera. And Mrs. Penniston, from the secluded watchtower of her upper window, could tell to a nicety just when the chronic volume of sound was increased by the sudden influx setting toward a Van Osburgh ball, or when the multiplication of wheels meant merely that the opera was over, or that there was a big supper at Sherry's. The Mrs. Penniston followed the rise and culmination of the season as keenly as the most active sharer in its gaieties, and as a looker on, she enjoyed opportunities and comparison and generalization, such as those who take part most proverbially forego. No one could have kept a more accurate record of social fluctuations or put more of an unerring finger on the distinguishing features of each season. Its dullness, its extravagance, its lack of balls or excess of divorces. She had a special memory for the vicissitudes of the new people, who rose to the surface with each such recurring tide and were either submerged beneath its rush or landed triumphantly beyond the reach of envious breakers. And she was apt to display a remarkable retrospective insight into their ultimate fate, so that when they had fulfilled their destiny, she was almost always able to say to Grace Stepney, the recipient of all her prophecies, that she had known exactly what would happen. This particular season, Mrs. Penniston would have characterized as that in which everybody felt poor except the Welly Brys and Mr. Simon Rosedale. It had been a bad autumn for Wall Street, where the prices fell in accordance with that peculiar law which proves railway stocks and bales of cotton to be more sensitive to the allotment of the executive power than many estimable citizens trained to all the advantages of self-government. Even fortune, supposed to be independent of the market, either betrayed a secret dependence on it or suffered from the sympathetic affection. Fashion sulked in its country houses, or came to town incognito. General entertainments were discountenanced, and informality and short dinners became the fashion. The society, amused for a while at playing Cinderella, soon wearied of that hearthside role, and welcomed the fairy godmother back in the shape of any magician powerful enough to turn the shrunken pumpkin again into the golden coach. The mere fact of growing richer at a time when most people's investments were shrinking is calculated to attract envious attention, and according to Wall Street Rumours, Welly Bry and Rosedale had found the secret of performing this miracle. Rosedale, in particular, was said to have doubled his fortune, and there was talk of his buying the newly finished house of one of the victims of the crash, who in the space of 12 short months had made the same number of millions, built a house in Fifth Avenue, filled a picture gallery with old masters, entertained all New York in it, and been smuggled out of the country between a trained nurse and a doctor, while his creditors mounted guard over the old masters, and his guests explained to each other that they had dined with him only because they wanted to see the pictures. Mr. Rosedale meant to have a less meteoric career. He knew that he should have to go slowly, and the instincts of his race fitted him to suffer rebuffs and put up with delays. But he was prompt to perceive that the general dullness of the season afforded him an unusual opportunity to shine. And he set about with patient industry to form a background for his growing glory. Mrs. Fisher was of immense service to him at this period. She had set off so many newcomers on the social stage that she was like one of those pieces of stock scenery which tell the experienced spectator exactly what is going to take place. But Mr. Rosedale wanted in the long run a more individual environment. He was sensitive to shades of difference which Miss Barts would never have credited him with perceiving, because he had no corresponding variations of manner, and it was becoming more and more clear to him that Miss Bart had possessed precisely the complementary qualities needed to round off his social personality. Such details did not fall within the range of Mrs. Peniston's vision. Like many minds of panoramic sweep, hers was apt to overlook the minutiae and of the foreground, and she was much more likely to know where Carrie Fisher had found the Welly Brys chef for them than what was happening to her own niece. She was not, however, without purveyors of information ready to supplement her deficiencies. Grace Stepney's mind was like a kind of a moral flypaper, to which the buzzing items of gossip were drawn by fatal attraction, and where they hung fast in the toils of an inexorable memory. Lily would have been surprised to know how many trivial facts concerning herself were lodged in Miss Stepney's head. She was quite aware that she was of interest to dingy people, but as assumed that there is only one form of dinginess, and that admiration for brilliancy is the natural expression of its inferior state. She knew that Gerty Farish admired her blindly, and therefore supposed that she inspired the same sentiments of Grace Stepney, whom she studied as a Gerty Farish, without the saving traits of youth and enthusiasm. In reality, the two differed from each other as much as they differed from the object of their mutual contemplation. Miss Farish's heart was a fountain of tender illusions, Miss Stepney's a precise register of facts as manifested in their relation to herself. She had sensibilities which to Lily would have seemed comic in a person with a freckled nose and red eyelids who lived in a boarding-house and admired Mrs. Peniston's drawing-room, but to poor Grace her limitations gave them more of a concentrated inner life, as poor soil starves certain plants into intenser efflorescence. She had in truth no abstract propensity to malice. She did not dislike Lily because the latter was brilliant and predominant, but because she thought that Lily disliked her. It is less mortifying to believe oneself unpopular than insignificant, and vanity prefers to assume that indifference is a latent form of unfriendliness. Even such scant civilities as Lily accorded to Mr. Rosedale would have made Miss Stepney her friend for life. But how could she foresee that such a friend was worth cultivating? How, moreover, can a young woman who has never been ignored measure the pang which this injury inflicts? And lastly, how could Lily, accustomed to choose between a pressure of engagements, guess that she had mortally offended Miss Stepney by causing her to be excluded from one of Mrs. Peniston's infrequent dining parties? Mrs. Peniston disliked giving dinners, but she had a high sense of family obligation, And on the Jack Stepney's return from their honeymoon, she felt it incumbent upon her to light the drawing-room lamps and extract her best silver from the safe deposit vaults. Mrs. Peniston's rare entertainments were preceded by days of heart-rending vacillation as to every detail of the feast, from the seating of the guests to the pattern of the tablecloth. And in the course of one of these preliminary discussions, she had imprudently suggested that her cousin Grace come, as the dinner was a family affair, and she might be included in it. For a week, the project had lighted up Miss Stepney's colorless existence. Then she had given to understand that it would be more convenient to have her another day. Miss Stepney knew exactly what had happened. Lily, to whom the family reunions were occasions of unalloyed dullness, had persuaded her aunt that a dinner of smart people would be much more to the taste of the young couple, and Mrs. Peniston, who leaned helplessly on her niece in social matters, had been prevailed upon to pronounce Grace's exile. After all, Grace could come at any other day. Why should she mind being put off? It was precisely because Miss Stepney could come any other day, and because she knew her relations were in the secret of her unoccupied evenings. But this incident loomed gigantically on her horizon. She was aware that she had Lily to thank for it, and dull resentment was turned to active animosity. Mrs. Peniston, on whom she had looked in a day or two after the dinner, laid down her crochet work and turned abruptly from her oblique survey of Fifth Avenue. "Gus Trenor, Lily and Gus Trenor," she said, glowing so suddenly pale that her visitor was almost alarmed. "Oh, Cousin Julia, of course I don't mean—" "I don't know what you do mean," said Mrs. Peniston, with a frightened quiver in her small, fretful voice. "Such things were never heard of in my day. And my own niece. I'm not sure I understand you. Do people say that he's in love with her?" Mrs. Peniston's horror was genuine. Though she boasted an unequaled familiarity with the secret chronicles of society, she had the innocence of a schoolgirl who regards wickedness as a part of history, and to whom it never occurs that the scandals she reads of in the lesson hours may be repeating themselves in the next street. Mrs. Peniston had kept her imagination shrouded, like the dining-room furniture. She knew, of course, that society was very much changed, and that many women her mother would have thought peculiar were now in a position to be critical about their visiting lists. She had discussed the perils of divorce with her rector, and had felt thankful at times that Lily was still unmarried. But the idea that any scandal should attach to a young girl's name, above all, that it could be lightly coupled with that of a married man, was so new to her that she was as much aghast as if she had been accused of leaving her carpets down all summer, or of violating any of the other cardinal laws of housekeeping. Miss Stepney, when her first fright had subsided, began to feel the superiority of that greater breadth of mind confers. It was really pitiable to be as ignorant of the world as Mrs. Peniston. She smiled at the latter's question. "People always say unpleasant things, and certainly they're a great deal together. A friend of mine met them the other afternoon in the park, quite late, after the lamps were lit. It's a pity Lily makes herself so conspicuous." "Conspicuous?" gasped Mrs. Peniston. She bent forward, lowering her voice to mitigate the horror. "What sort of things do they say? That he means to get a divorce and marry her?" Grace Stepney laughed outright. "Dear me, no, he would hardly do that. It's a flirtation, nothing more." "A flirtation? Between my niece and a married man? Do you mean to tell me that, with Lily's looks and advantages, she could find no better use for her time than to waste it on a fat, stupid man almost old enough to be her father?" The argument had such a convincing ring that it gave Mrs. Peniston sufficient reassurance to pick up her work, while she waited for Grace Stepney to rally her scattered forces. But Miss Stepney was on the spot in an instant. That's the worst of it. People say she isn't wasting her time. Everyone knows, as you say, that Lily is too handsome and charming to devote herself to a man like Gus Trenor. Unless, echoed Mrs. Peniston. Her visitor drew a breath nervously. It was agreeable to shock Mrs. Peniston, but not to shock her to the verge of anger. Miss Stepney was not sufficiently familiar with the classic drama to have recalled in advance how bearers of bad tidings are proverbially received, but she now had a rapid vision of forfeited dinners and a reduced wardrobe as the possible consequence of her disinterestedness. To the honor of her sex, however, hatred of Lily prevailed over more personal considerations. Mrs. Peniston had chosen the wrong moment to boast of her niece's charms. Unless, said Grace, leaning forward to speak with low-toned emphasis, unless there are material advantages to be gained by making herself agreeable to him. She felt that the moment was tremendous and remembered suddenly that Mrs. Peniston's black brocade with the cut jet fringe would have been hers at the end of the season. Mrs. Peniston put down her work again. Another aspect of the same idea had presented itself to her, and she felt that it was beneath her dignity to have her nerves racked by a dependent relative who wore her old clothes. "If you take pleasure in annoying me by mysterious insinuations," she said coldly, "you might at least have chosen a more suitable time than just as I am recovering from the strain of giving a large dinner." The mention of the dinner dispelled Miss Stepney's last scruples. "I don't know why I should be accused of taking pleasure in telling you about Lily. I was sure I shouldn't get any thanks for it," she returned it with a flare of temper. "But I have some family feeling left, and as you are the only person who has any authority over Lily, I thought you ought to know what is being said of her." "Well," said Mrs. Peniston, what I complain of is that you haven't told me what is being said." "I didn't suppose I should have to put it so plainly. People say that Gus Trenor is paying her bills." "Paying her bills? Her bills?" Mrs. Peniston broke into a laugh. "I can't imagine where you can have picked up such rubbish. Lily has her own income, and I provide for her very handsomely." "Oh, we all know that," interposed Miss Stepney dryly. "But Lily wears a great many smart gowns." "I like her to be well dressed. It's only suitable." "Certainly, but then there are her gambling debts besides." Miss Stepney in the beginning had not meant to bring up this point, but Mrs. Peniston had only her own incredulity to blame. She was like the stiff-necked unbelievers of Scripture, who must be annihilated to be convinced. "Gambling debts! Lily!" Mrs. Peniston's voice shook with anger and bewilderment. She wondered whether Grace Stepney had gone out of her mind. "What do you mean by gambling debts?" "Simply that if one plays bridge for money in Lily's set, one is liable to lose a great deal. And I don't suppose Lily always wins." "Who told you that my niece played cards for money?" "Mercy, Cousin Julia, don't look at me as though I were trying to turn you against Lily. Everybody knows she's crazy about bridge. Mrs. Gryce told me herself that it was her gambling that frightened Percy Gryce. It seemed that he was quite taken with her at first. But of course, among Lily's friends, it's quite common for girls to play for money. In fact, people are inclined to excuse her on that account." "To excuse her for what?" "For being hard up and accepting attentions from men like Gus Trenor and George Dorset." Mrs. Peniston gave another cry. "George Dorset? Is there anyone else? I should like to know the worst, if you please." "Don't put it that way, Cousin Julia. Lately, Lily has been a good deal with the Dorsets, and he seems to admire her. But, of course, that's only natural. And I'm sure there's no truth in the horrid things people say. But she has been spending a great deal of money this winter. Evie Van Osburgh was at Céleste ordering her trousseau the other day. Yes, that marriage takes place next month. And she told me that Céleste showed her the most exquisite things that she was just sending home to Lily." And people say that Gerty Trenor has quarreled with her on account of Gus. But I'm sorry I spoke, though I only meant it as a kindness. Mrs. Peniston's genuine incredulity enabled her to dismiss Miss Stepney with disdain, which boded ill for that lady's prospect of succeeding to the black brocade. But minds impenetrable to reason generally have some crack through which suspicion filters, and her visitor's insinuation did not glide off as easily as she had expected. Mrs. Peniston disliked scenes, and her determination to avoid them had always led her to hold herself aloof from the details of Lily's life. In her youth, girls had not been supposed to require close supervision. They were generally assumed to be taken up with the legitimate business of courtship and marriage, and interference in such affairs on the part of their natural guardians was considered unwarrantable, as a spectator suddenly joining in the game. There had been, of course, the fast girls, even in Mrs. Peniston's early experience, but their fastness at worst was understood to be a mere excess of animal spirits, against which there could be no graver charge than that of being unladylike. The modern fastness appeared synonymous with immorality, and the mere idea of immorality was as offensive to Mrs. Peniston as the smell of cooking in the drawing room. It was one of the conceptions her mind refused to admit. She had no immediate intention of repeating to Lily what she had heard, or even of trying to ascertain its truth by means of discreet interrogation. To do so might be to provoke a scene, and a scene in the shaken state of Mrs. Peniston's nerves, with the effect of her dinner not worn off and her mind still tremulous with the new impressions, was a risk she deemed it her duty to avoid. But there remained in her thoughts a settled deposit of resentment against her niece, all the denser because it was not to be cleared by explanation or discussion. It was horrible of a young girl to let herself be talked about. However unfounded the charges against her, she must be to blame for their having been made. Mrs. Peniston felt as if there had been a contagious illness in the house, and she was doomed to sit shivering among her contaminated furniture. End of chapter 11.